In the depths of the Vietnamese jungle, somewhere near the Cambodian border, a Viet Cong soldier wrote these words in his diary. They appeared without sound and vanished before we even realized they were there. He was describing the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS. And across the VC ranks, from company commanders to foot soldiers, one sentiment echoed through intelligence reports and whispered conversations. These men were different. They were feared. They were hated. Not because they were cruel, but because they were impossibly effective. The Americans came in waves, with artillery and air support, predictable and loud. The South Vietnamese forces were known quantities, but the Australians, the SAS, they moved like the jungle itself, silent, patient, deadly. Another Viet Cong report recovered after the war described them simply as silent hunters. Others called them Ma, ghosts. Some units refused to patrol areas where Australian tracks had been found. But here's what the enemy didn't see. Exhausted men, covered in leeches, soaked through with sweat and monsoon rain, moving on 2 hours of sleep and cold rations. They weren't hunting ghosts. They were executing their training in some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. One SAS veteran recalled, "We weren't superhuman. We were tired, hungry, and scared most of the time. But we had discipline. We had each other. And we knew that if we made a mistake, we wouldn't be coming home." Over the next hour, you're going to see why this small force, never more than a few hundred men at any given time, dominated the Viet Cong. You'll understand how they did it. And you'll hear what it cost them. This is the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam, told from both sides. To understand why the Viet Cong hated fighting the SAS, you have to understand how fear spreads through an army. Not the fear of a single battle, but a deeper dread. The kind that makes experienced soldiers hesitate before entering certain areas. The kind that turns veterans cautious. By 1967, Viet Cong intelligence officers were circulating reports about the Australians. These weren't propaganda. They were tactical assessments, warnings passed down through the command structure. One document, translated after the war, described the SAS as operating with methods we cannot predict or counter with conventional tactics. Let me give you an example. In Phuoc Tuy Province, a VC company, roughly 120 men, was moving at night along a known trail. They had scouts. They had discipline. They'd made this movement dozens of times. But this time, an SAS patrol of 6 men was waiting. The ambush lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, the VC had taken heavy casualties. The Australians had vanished. No trace, no sound. Just the jungle, silent, again, as if nothing had happened. The surviving VC commander filed a report. He described the attack as coming from nowhere and everywhere. He couldn't determine how many enemy soldiers had been present. He couldn't explain how they'd known his route, and he had no idea where they'd gone. This wasn't an isolated incident. It happened again and again. Small SAS patrols, moving undetected, striking with precision, and disappearing before the enemy could react. One Viet Cong veteran, interviewed decades later, said, "We learned to fear the Australians more than the Americans. The Americans, you could hear them. You could prepare. But the Australians, you never knew they were there until it was too late." The psychological impact was profound. VC units began avoiding certain areas entirely. If tracks were found, if signs of Australian movement were detected, orders would sometimes be given to pull back, to find another route. This wasn't cowardice, it was tactical reality. Engaging the SAS on their terms was suicide. Intelligence reports from the period show the VC tried to adapt. They increased security on patrols. They moved in larger groups. They set counter ambushes. But the SAS adapted faster. They changed tactics, altered routes, and remained unpredictable. There's a telling comparison here. The Viet Cong understood American tactics. They knew the Americans relied on firepower, on air support, on large unit operations. They could anticipate American movements, set traps, and fade away when the situation turned against them. But the Australians, the SAS, they operated on a completely different doctrine. They used the jungle the way the VC did. They moved at night. They relied on stealth over firepower. They thought like hunters, not soldiers. One American advisor working with Australian forces noted in his after-action report, "The VC don't understand these guys. They move like locals. They think like guerrillas. But they hit like a conventional force. It's throwing the enemy completely off balance." And it wasn't just fear of the ambushes. It was the intelligence gathering. SAS patrols would spend days, sometimes weeks, observing VC movements without being detected. They'd map out supply routes, identify command posts, and relay coordinates for airstrikes or larger operations. The VC knew they were being watched. They just didn't know when, or where, or by whom. Imagine that. Imagine being a soldier, moving through territory you thought you controlled, knowing that somewhere out there, invisible, were men watching your every move. Men who could kill you at any moment, or simply observe you until your position was destroyed by artillery you'd never see coming. That's the kind of fear the SAS instilled. Not the fear of a single firefight, but the constant, gnawing dread of being hunted by an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't escape. One VC commander reportedly told his men, "If you see Australians, do not engage. Mark the position and withdraw. We will deal with them on our terms, not theirs." But the problem was simple. By the time you saw them, it was already too late. So how did they do it? How did a handful of Australian soldiers consistently outwit and outfight a battle-hardened enemy on their own terrain? The answer isn't mystique. It's not luck. It's training, discipline, and an absolute mastery of the environment. Let's start with patrol doctrine. The SAS operated in small patrols, usually 5 to 6 men. Each man had a specific role: patrol commander, medic, signaler, scouts. Everyone was cross-trained. If the medic went down, someone else could take over. If the radio operator was hit, the commander could call for extraction. This wasn't revolutionary, but the discipline with which they executed it was. Standard operating procedure for an SAS patrol was simple on paper, brutal in execution. They'd move slowly, sometimes covering less than a kilometer in an hour. Every step was deliberate. Every sound was controlled. They communicated through hand signals, not words. They avoided trails, avoided open ground, and moved through the thickest, nastiest jungle they could find. Why? Because that's where the enemy wasn't looking. One SAS trooper described it this way: "You're not just walking. You're thinking about every footfall, every branch, every leaf. You're watching the ground for tripwires. You're watching the canopy for snipers. You're listening for sounds that don't belong. And you're doing this for hours, in heat that would drop most men, carrying 40 kilos of gear." This is where the bushcraft comes in. The skill that separated the SAS from almost every other unit in Vietnam. Australian soldiers grew up in a harsh environment. Many came from rural backgrounds, from the outback, from places where survival meant understanding the land. The Australian Army built on that foundation with training that was, by all accounts, merciless. SAS selection and training emphasized navigation, tracking, and fieldcraft. Before they ever set foot in Vietnam, these men could read the jungle like a book. They could tell if a branch had been broken by an animal or a person. They could identify human tracks days old, estimate the size of the group, and determine their direction. They could smell cooking fires from kilometers away. They could hear the difference between a monkey moving through the canopy and a man trying to do the same. That last one was critical. The jungle is never silent. There's always noise. Birds, insects, animals. But when humans move through, the jungle reacts. Birds stop calling. Monkeys go quiet. The insects pause. An experienced SAS patrol could detect enemy presence simply by listening to the absence of sound. One patrol commander recalled, "We'd stop, sometimes for 20 minutes, just listening. The blokes would think I'd gone mad, but you learn to trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it usually is." And then there's movement. The art of moving silently through the jungle is something most people can't comprehend. It's not just about stepping carefully. It's about controlling your breathing, your gear, your weapon. It's about understanding how vegetation moves in the wind and moving with it. It's about patience. SAS patrols would sometimes take an entire minute to move 3 meters. One step, pause, listen. Another step, pause, listen. They'd test the ground before committing their weight. They'd move branches aside slowly, then ease them back into place. It was exhausting, physically and mentally, but it kept them alive. Now, when the SAS did engage, it was on their terms. Always. They didn't go looking for fights. They went looking for intelligence, for supply routes, for enemy positions. But when contact was inevitable, or when an opportunity presented itself, they struck hard and fast. SAS ambushes were textbook. The patrol would set up in an L-shaped formation, covering a trail or river crossing. They'd wait, sometimes for days, until the enemy moved through the kill zone. Then, they'd open fire with coordinated, overlapping fields of fire. The engagement would last seconds. Then they'd withdraw, moving through pre-planned extraction routes, leaving no trace. One veteran described it. "You'd be lying there, in the mud, in the heat, not moving, barely breathing, leeches crawling on you, mosquitoes everywhere. And then the enemy would appear. You'd let them walk right into the kill zone, and then it was over. You didn't think, you just executed, and then you got the hell out." This is where discipline becomes everything. In the chaos of an ambush, in the noise and the smoke and the fear, these men didn't panic. They followed their training. They trusted their mates, and they survived. But it wasn't just about the ambush itself. It was about the withdrawal. That's where most units got into trouble. They'd hit the enemy, then try to stay and fight. The SAS didn't. They'd strike, break, contact, and vanish. They understood something fundamental. In the jungle, mobility is survival. If you stay in one place, you die. Their weapons reflected this philosophy. Most SAS patrols carried the L1A-1 SLR, the self-loading rifle. Reliable, accurate, hard-hitting. Some carried M16s for the lighter weight. The patrol scout might carry a shotgun for close-quarters work. They traveled light on ammunition because noise discipline was more important than firepower. Every round had to count. Suppressive fire was a last resort. They also carried claymore mines, grenades, and smoke for emergencies. But the real weapon was their training. Their ability to think, adapt, and execute under pressure. One SAS officer put it simply, "We didn't outgun the enemy. We outthought them." And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle: initiative. SAS patrols operated with a level of autonomy that was almost unheard of in conventional forces. Patrol commanders were empowered to make decisions on the ground, to adapt to changing situations without waiting for orders. If they found an opportunity, they took it. If they sensed danger, they withdrew. They trusted their instincts, and their command trusted them. This wasn't cowboys running wild. It was calculated risk-taking by men who understood their capabilities and their limitations. One patrol commander recalled, "You'd get your mission brief, recon this area, gather intelligence, avoid contact if possible. But once you were out there, you were on your own. You had to make the calls, and you lived or died by those decisions." That level of responsibility, that level of trust, created a unique culture within the SAS. These weren't just soldiers following orders. They were professionals, executing a mission with precision and skill, and the Viet Cong, who were themselves masters of guerrilla warfare, recognized that. They knew they were facing an enemy who understood the jungle as well as they did, maybe better. That's why they feared the SAS. Not because of technology, not because of firepower, but because of skill, discipline, and an absolute refusal to fight on anything but their own terms. Let's talk about what this looked like in practice. Real patrols, real engagements, real men in real danger. Operation Crimp, early 1966. An SAS patrol, 6 men, inserted by helicopter into suspected VC territory northwest of Saigon. Their mission: reconnaissance. Locate enemy positions, map supply routes, and avoid contact if possible. The patrol moved off the landing zone immediately, disappearing into the jungle within minutes. They traveled slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to listen and observe. By nightfall, they'd covered less than 3 kilometers. They set up a harbor position, a defensive perimeter, where they'd spend the night. No fires, no talking, cold rations eaten in silence. One man on watch, while the others tried to sleep. On the second day, they found signs of recent enemy activity: tracks, disturbed vegetation, the smell of cooking fires. The patrol commander made the decision to shadow the enemy, to observe without engaging. For 3 days, they moved parallel to a VC supply route, watching, counting, recording. They identified a company-sized element, roughly 100 men, moving supplies toward a suspected base area. The intelligence was relayed back to headquarters. Within 48 hours, the area was hit by airstrikes. The supply route was interdicted. The VC lost critical supplies and took significant casualties. And the SAS patrol? They were extracted without ever firing a shot. This was the kind of mission the SAS excelled at: patience, discipline, intelligence gathering that saved lives and disrupted enemy operations. But not every patrol ended without contact. Operation Hobart, 1967. Another SAS patrol, this time 5 men, was moving through heavy jungle near the Bien Hoa province. They were tracking a suspected VC platoon when they stumbled into an enemy position. Contact was immediate. The lead scout took fire from less than 10 meters away. The patrol reacted instantly. The scout returned fire and went to ground. The rest of the patrol formed a defensive perimeter, laying down suppressive fire while the commander assessed the situation. They were outnumbered, possibly surrounded, in thick jungle, with limited visibility. The enemy knew their position. Every second mattered. The patrol commander made the call: break contact, and move to a pre-designated extraction point. They threw smoke grenades, creating confusion, and withdrew through the undergrowth in pairs, covering each other as they moved. The VC pursued, but the SAS moved faster, with purpose. They'd rehearsed this. They knew the ground. Within 20 minutes, they'd broken contact entirely. They reached the extraction point, called in their position, and waited. The helicopter came in under fire, but the patrol made it out. All 5 men, wounded, exhausted, but alive. The after-action report noted, patrol demonstrated excellent fire discipline and tactical awareness under extreme pressure. Enemy casualties estimated at 8 to 12. Friendly casualties, minor. But here's what the report doesn't tell you. The cost. The physical and mental toll of that kind of action. One of the men on that patrol later described it. You don't think about dying in the moment. You're too busy. But afterwards, when you're back at base, that's when it hits you. You realize how close you came. And then you have to do it again. The conditions made everything harder. The monsoon season turned the jungle into a swamp. Patrols would move through waist-deep water, leeches covering their legs, equipment soaked through. Sleep was impossible. Hypothermia was a real risk despite the heat. One trooper recalled, the rain was relentless, days on end. Everything was wet. Your weapon, your ammunition, your food. You'd find a spot to rest and you'd be lying in water. And you still had to maintain noise discipline. Still had to stay alert. The heat was just as brutal. Temperatures in the jungle could reach 40 degrees Celsius, with humidity near 100%. Men would lose liters of water through sweat. Dehydration was a constant threat. And then there were the leeches. Dozens of them, crawling up from the ground, attaching themselves to any exposed skin. You couldn't pull them off immediately, or you'd risk infection. You had to burn them off with a cigarette, carefully, while trying not to make any noise. One veteran said, the leeches were everywhere. On your legs, your arms, your neck. You'd feel them crawling into your boots, and you just had to accept it. You'd deal with them during a rest stop, but while you were moving, you ignored them. You had bigger problems. This is the reality that the enemy never saw. The Viet Cong feared the SAS because they seemed invincible, untouchable. But the truth was simpler and harder. These men were pushing themselves to the absolute limit every single day. They were cold, wet, exhausted, diseased, and terrified. But they did the job anyway, because that's what they'd trained for. That's what their mates depended on, and that's what would keep them alive. There's a word that defines the Australian military experience: mateship. It's not just friendship. It's deeper than that. It's trust, absolute and unquestioned. It's knowing that the man next to you will do anything to keep you alive, and you'll do the same for him. In the SAS, in Vietnam, mateship wasn't optional. It was survival. One veteran described it this way: you'd trust your mates with your life because you had to. There was no choice. If you went down, they'd carry you out, no matter what. And you'd do the same. That's not heroism. That's just what you did. This bond was forged in selection and training, then tested in the jungle. The men who made it through SAS selection weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the ones who could endure, who could push through pain and exhaustion and fear, and who could work as part of a team. Selection was brutal by design. Men would march for days with heavy packs, navigate through unfamiliar terrain with minimal sleep, and endure psychological pressure designed to break them. The instructors weren't looking for individuals. They were looking for men who would put the team first, who would keep going when everything in them said to quit. And the ones who made it? They formed bonds that lasted a lifetime. In Vietnam, humor was a survival mechanism. In the worst conditions, in the most dangerous situations, these men found ways to laugh. One trooper recalled a patrol where they'd been soaked by monsoon rain for 6 straight days. We're sitting there, in the mud, water dripping off everything. And one of the blokes says, "At least we don't have to worry about washing." We all just started laughing. Couldn't help it. You'd go mad otherwise. That ability to find humor, to maintain morale in impossible circumstances, was part of what made the SAS so effective. They didn't let the conditions defeat them. They adapted, they endured, and they looked after each other. Leadership played a crucial role. SAS patrol commanders weren't the typical military officers. They didn't lead from the rear. They led from the front, sharing the same risks, the same hardships as their men. And more importantly, they empowered their men to think, to contribute, to make decisions. One patrol commander explained his philosophy. "I had the best soldiers in the world under my command. My job wasn't to tell them what to do every second. It was to give them a mission, trust their training, and let them execute. If they had a better idea, I'd listen." This created a culture of mutual respect. The men trusted their commanders because those commanders trusted them. There was no ego, no hierarchy for its own sake, just professionals doing a job. Decision-making in the patrol was often collective. The commander had final say, but he'd consult with his men, especially the scouts who had the most experience reading the ground. One trooper recalled, "The boss would pull us together during a rest stop, show us the map, and ask what we thought. What do you reckon? This route or that one?" And he'd actually listen. If you had a concern, he'd consider it. But leadership also meant making the hard calls, deciding when to engage and when to withdraw, deciding whether to risk extraction or stay hidden, deciding who would take point on the next movement. Those decisions carried weight. They could mean the difference between life and death. And when things went wrong, when men were wounded or killed, commanders carried that burden. One officer, reflecting on a patrol where he'd lost a man, said, "You replay it in your mind, over and over. Could you have done something different? Could you have seen it coming?" And the answer is usually no. But that doesn't make it easier. The physical toll was obvious. The weight loss, the tropical diseases, the injuries. Men would return from patrols having lost 10, 15, sometimes 20 kilograms. They'd have malaria, dysentery, infected cuts that wouldn't heal in the humidity. But the psychological toll was just as real, if less visible. Living in a state of constant vigilance, never fully relaxing, knowing that one mistake could get you killed. It wore on you. One veteran described it, "You'd be back at base, supposedly safe, and you'd still be on edge. You'd hear a loud noise, and you'd jump. You'd wake up in the middle of the night, ready to move." It took time to come down from that. Sleep deprivation was standard. On patrol, men would get maybe 2 hours of sleep a night, if they were lucky. The rest of the time, they were either moving or on watch. The hunger was constant. They carried rations, but not enough to fully sustain them during extended patrols. They'd return from the field gaunt, hollow-eyed, running on willpower alone. One trooper recalled, "The ration packs were cold, tasteless, and never enough. And you'd dream about hot food, real food, a steak, a beer, simple things." But despite all of this, despite the conditions and the danger and the exhaustion, these men kept going. They kept patrolling, kept fighting, kept doing their jobs. Why? Part of it was pride. Pride in the unit, in the badge, in the tradition. The SAS represented the best, and they wanted to live up to that. Part of it was duty. They'd volunteered for this. They'd been selected for this, and they weren't going to let their mates down. But mostly, it was mateship. The knowledge that the man next to you was counting on you. That if you quit, you weren't just letting yourself down, you were letting your mates down. And that was unacceptable. One veteran summed it up simply. You didn't do it for medals or glory. You did it for your mates. Everything else was secondary. That's the human element. That's what the Viet Cong never saw when they filed their reports about ghosts and silent hunters. They were facing men, tired, scared, hurting men who refused to quit because they couldn't let each other down. Now let's talk about impact, about what a handful of men, properly trained and employed, can accomplish. The numbers are striking. Throughout the war, SAS squadrons in Vietnam numbered around 100 to 120 men at any given time. Small teams, usually 5 to 6 men per patrol, operating across vast areas of jungle. And yet, their impact was disproportionate to their size. Between 1966 and 1971, SAS patrols in Vietnam conducted thousands of reconnaissance missions. They identified enemy positions, mapped supply routes, and called in airstrikes and artillery that disrupted VC operations across Phuoc Tuy province. But more than that, they created uncertainty. The enemy never knew where they were, never knew when they might strike. Entire areas became effectively denied to the VC because of the risk of encountering an SAS patrol. One intelligence officer noted, "An SAS patrol in the right place at the right time could achieve what a company of infantry couldn't. They'd spot enemy movement, relay coordinates, and within hours, that enemy force would be destroyed by air power, all without the SAS firing a shot." Let's look at a specific example. Operation Ingham, 1967. An SAS patrol was inserted into the Hat Dick area, a known VC stronghold. Their mission was simple: observe and report. For 8 days, they moved through the jungle, tracking enemy movements, identifying bunker systems and supply caches. They observed a VC battalion moving through the area, counted the numbers, noted the equipment. The intelligence they gathered was relayed back. Within 48 hours, the area was hit by B-52 strikes. The VC battalion was devastated. Supply caches were destroyed. The enemy's plans for the region were disrupted for months. 6 men, 8 days. Strategic impact. Contrast this with conventional operations. A large-scale sweep through the same area might have involved hundreds of soldiers, artillery support, helicopter gunships. It would have been loud, obvious, and the enemy would have simply melted away. The SAS didn't announce their presence. They slipped in, gathered what they needed, and directed force from a distance. This approach was fundamentally different from American tactics. The Americans, for all their firepower and technology, tended to operate in large units. They'd sweep through an area, engage the enemy, and then move on. The VC adapted to this. They'd avoid large American formations, hit smaller units, and use the terrain to their advantage. But the SAS? They operated more like the VC themselves. Small, mobile, unpredictable. The enemy couldn't adapt because there was no pattern to exploit. One American officer, observing SAS operations, noted, "These guys fight like the enemy, but with the discipline and training of a first-world military. It's incredibly effective." The SAS also excelled at direct action when required. Ambushes were surgical. A patrol would identify a high-value target, a supply convoy, or a VC command element, set up an ambush, and execute with precision. One such ambush, in 1968, saw an SAS patrol engage a VC platoon. The engagement lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the VC had taken heavy casualties. The SAS had none. The patrol commander's report was brief. Enemy encountered at grid reference. Engaged and neutralized. Patrol withdrew without casualties. Mission continues. This efficiency wasn't luck. It was the result of meticulous planning, rehearsal, and execution. Every ambush was thought through. Every man knew his role. Every contingency was considered. And when the moment came, they executed flawlessly. But the impact went beyond individual engagements. The presence of SAS patrols forced the VC to change their behavior across entire regions. Supply movements became more difficult. Command elements had to relocate constantly. Training areas were compromised. The VC couldn't operate freely in areas they'd once controlled. One captured VC document outlined new procedures for movement in Phuoc Tuy. Larger security details, more frequent changes of route, night movements only, and immediate withdrawal if Australian signs were detected. These changes slowed VC operations, increased their logistical burden, and made them more predictable to Allied intelligence. The strategic effect was cumulative. Each SAS patrol, each piece of intelligence, each successful ambush eroded VC capability and morale, and it was achieved by a force that, at its peak, numbered barely more than 100 men. One Australian commander summarized it: "We're not trying to hold ground. We're not trying to win hearts and minds. We're here to find the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them. And we're very good at it." The cost effectiveness was remarkable. An SAS patrol cost a fraction of what a conventional infantry operation cost, yet often achieved better results. They required minimal logistical support. They didn't need forward bases or supply convoys. They carried what they needed, moved by helicopter, and operated independently for extended periods. One logistics officer calculated that an SAS patrol consumed less resources in a week than an infantry platoon consumed in a day, yet achieved disproportionate results. This efficiency made the SAS invaluable to the overall war effort in their area of operations. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. The VC's fear of the SAS, their reluctance to operate in certain areas, their constant vigilance and paranoia that couldn't be measured in body counts or territory controlled. But it was real, and it was effective. One Australian intelligence analyst noted, "The VC respect us. They fear us. And that gives us an advantage that goes beyond any tactical consideration. They're fighting on their terms everywhere else. But when they're facing us, they're fighting on ours." That's the impact of small teams, properly trained and employed. Not overwhelming force, but precision, skill, and psychological dominance. The Viet Cong weren't static. They learned, they adapted, they tried to counter the SAS threat, but their attempts revealed just how effective the Australians were. VC intelligence documents from 1968 show explicit instructions for dealing with Australian forces. Units were told to avoid engagement where possible, to report Australian movements immediately, and to never pursue Australian patrols into thick jungle. Some VC units developed almost superstitious beliefs about the Australians. There were reports of local forces refusing to patrol certain areas, claiming they were cursed or haunted by the silent hunters. This wasn't cowardice. These were battle-hardened fighters who'd faced American firepower for years. But something about the SAS got into their heads. One VC company commander, captured in 1969, was interviewed about Australian forces. He said, "We could fight the Americans. We understood them. But the Australians, they were different. They moved like us, but they were more disciplined, more patient. When we knew they were in an area, we avoided it." The interviewer asked if this was an official policy. The commander replied, "It didn't have to be official. It was survival." This respect, mixed with fear, persisted throughout the war. Even as the VC developed counter-tactics, even as they became more cautious and prepared, they never truly overcame the psychological impact of facing the SAS. Some of their adaptations were practical. They increased patrol sizes, hoping that numbers would give them an advantage. But this made them more visible, easier to track, and more vulnerable to airstrikes called in by SAS observers. They tried to set counter-ambushes, positioning forces to respond if an attack occurred. But the SAS rarely stayed in place long enough for reinforcements to arrive. They attempted to track Australian patrols, to follow them back to their bases or ambush points. But SAS anti-tracking techniques made this nearly impossible. False trails, backtracking, moving through water. The Australians were always one step ahead. In some ways, the VC's attempts to counter the SAS actually made them more vulnerable. The changes in behavior, the increased caution, the altered movement patterns, all of this was noted by Australian intelligence and exploited. One SAS commander observed, "They're so worried about us that they've changed how they operate. And those changes make them predictable, which makes our job easier." It was a psychological victory as much as a tactical one. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends far beyond that conflict. The lessons learned, the tactics developed, the culture established, all of it shaped modern special operations. Many of the techniques pioneered by the SAS in Vietnam became standard practice for special forces worldwide. The emphasis on small unit tactics, on stealth and patience, on intelligence gathering over direct action. These are now fundamental principles. The Australian Special Forces today, the direct descendants of these Vietnam-era operators, are considered among the best in the world. They've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, East Timor, and countless other operations, always with the same emphasis on skill, discipline, and mateship. And they trace their lineage directly back to those patrols in the Vietnamese jungle. One modern SAS operator, reflecting on the legacy, said, "We stand on the shoulders of those men. Everything we do, every technique we use, it comes from what they proved in Vietnam." They showed that a small number of highly trained men, properly employed, can achieve strategic effects. That's the model we still follow. The influence extends beyond Australia. American, British, and other allied special forces studied Australian operations in Vietnam and incorporated the lessons into their own doctrine. The emphasis on cultural awareness, on understanding the enemy's perspective, on adapting to local conditions. These became hallmarks of successful special operations. One American Special Forces officer who served alongside Australians in later conflicts noted, "The Aussies have a way of operating that's uniquely effective. They're aggressive when they need to be, but they're also patient. They think long-term, and they never forget that the human element, the relationships, and the culture matter as much as the tactics." There's also a personal legacy. The veterans of those Vietnam patrols carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Some struggled with the memories, with the things they'd seen and done. Others found pride in their service, in what they'd accomplished. But all of them understood that they'd been part of something significant. They'd proven that courage, skill, and mateship could overcome almost any obstacle. One veteran, speaking at a reunion years after the war, said, "We went there as young men. We came back, changed, but we came back together. And that matters more than any battle, any medal, any recognition." The bonds formed in those jungle patrols never broke. Decades later, these men still gather, still remember, still support each other. That's the real legacy. Not just the tactical innovations or the operational successes, but the human connections forged under the worst possible conditions. Let's return to where we started. That Viet Cong diary entry, "They appeared without sound and vanished before we even realized they were there." Now you understand what that soldier was describing. Not ghosts, not mythical warriors, but highly trained, deeply committed professionals who mastered their craft and executed it with devastating effectiveness. The Australian SAS in Vietnam were feared because they earned that fear through skill, through discipline, through an absolute refusal to be anything less than the best. But they were also human. They suffered, they struggled, they doubted, and they kept going anyway. One final veteran reflection captures it perfectly. People ask me what it was like, serving in the SAS in Vietnam, and I tell them, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. It tested everything I had, but I was with the best men I've ever known, and that made all the difference. The SAS success in Vietnam wasn't about superior numbers or overwhelming firepower. It was about men who refused to accept defeat, who adapted to their environment, and who looked after each other no matter what. The Viet Cong hated fighting them because the Australians took away every advantage the VC normally had. The jungle wasn't a refuge anymore. The darkness wasn't protection. The enemy couldn't predict them, couldn't track them, couldn't escape them. And behind all of that was something simple: mateship, trust, discipline, and an absolute commitment to the mission and to each other. When the Australian SAS withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, they left behind a record that speaks for itself. Thousands of patrols, countless intelligence reports, disrupted enemy operations, strategic impact far beyond their numbers. But more than that, they left behind a standard for how special operations should be conducted, a standard that emphasized skill over firepower, patience over aggression, and teamwork over individual heroics. The men who served in those patrols didn't seek glory. Many of them never spoke about their experiences, even to their families. They did their job, came home, and tried to move on with their lives. But their legacy endures. In the modern Australian Special Forces, in the tactics used by elite units worldwide, and in the memories of those who served alongside them. One American officer who worked with the SAS wrote in his memoirs, "I've served with special forces from a dozen countries, but the Australians in Vietnam, they were something else. They had a way of operating that was both supremely professional and deeply human. They were warriors, but they never lost sight of why they were fighting or who they were fighting for." The respect wasn't just from allies. Even former enemies acknowledged what the SAS had achieved. Years after the war, a Vietnamese military historian was asked about the Australian forces. He said, "They were different from the Americans, quieter, more patient, more dangerous. Our soldiers learned to be very careful when operating in areas where Australians were known to patrol. That respect, earned in the most difficult conditions imaginable, is perhaps the truest measure of their success." The fear the Viet Cong felt wasn't irrational. It wasn't based on propaganda or myth. It was based on hard experience, on patrols that vanished, on ambushes that came from nowhere, on an enemy that seemed to know your every move before you made it. And behind that fear was respect. The kind of respect one warrior gives to another when they recognize true skill, true courage, true commitment. The Australian SAS didn't just fight in Vietnam. They redefined what small unit operations could achieve. They proved that with the right training, the right mindset, and the right team, a handful of men could change the strategic picture. But they also paid a price. Some didn't come home. Others came home carrying wounds that never fully healed, physical and psychological. The jungle took its toll. The war took its toll. One veteran, reflecting on a mate who didn't make it back, said, "He was the best of us, calm under pressure, skilled beyond measure, always looking out for his mates. And he died doing what he believed in. That's all any of us can ask for." The families of these men paid a price too. Months of worry, of not knowing if their husband, father, son, or brother would come home. And when they did come home, often changed by what they'd experienced. One wife recalled, "He came back different, quieter, more watchful. It took years before he could talk about what he'd been through, but I never doubted his courage or his character. He did what he had to do, and he did it with honor." That's the human cost, the part that doesn't make it into the after-action reports or the history books, the part that these men and their families carried with them long after the war ended. But through it all, the bonds held, the mateship endured. Decades after Vietnam, these veterans still gather, still support each other, still honor those who didn't come home. At one such gathering, an aging SAS trooper raised his glass and said simply, "To absent friends," and every man there understood. The ones who didn't make it, the ones who came home but were never quite the same, the ones who gave everything. That's the real story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. Not just the tactical victories or the strategic impact, but the human story. Men facing impossible odds, supporting each other, and refusing to quit. The Viet Cong feared them because they were effective, but history honors them because they were more than that. They were professionals who maintained their humanity even in the most inhumane conditions. They were warriors who never lost sight of what they were fighting for. And they were mates, brothers, a team that would go through hell for each other without hesitation. One modern SAS operator asked what the Vietnam veterans mean to his generation, said, "They set the standard we measure ourselves against, not just tactically, but morally. They showed us that you can be tough and still be human, that you can be deadly and still be honorable." That's the legacy we carry forward. As we close this story, think about what these men achieved. A small force, never more than 100 or so at any given time, operating in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, facing an enemy that knew the terrain, that had local support, that was highly motivated and experienced. And yet, the Australian SAS dominated. They didn't just survive, they excelled. They set a standard that has endured for more than 50 years. That Viet Cong soldier who wrote about men who appeared without sound and vanished before we even realized they were there wasn't describing ghosts or legends. He was describing real men doing a real job with extraordinary skill. Men like the patrol commander who led his team through 8 days of observation, gathering intelligence that changed the strategic picture. Men like the scout who walked point, knowing he'd be the first to face danger. Men like the signaler who kept communications open under the worst conditions, Men like the medics who kept their mates alive when everything was trying to kill them. These weren't superheroes. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things because their training, their discipline, and their mates demanded it. They were hungry, tired, scared, and in pain most of the time. But they kept going. They kept executing. They kept looking after each other. And when it was over, when they came home, they didn't demand recognition. They didn't seek glory. Most of them just wanted to move on, to build lives, to be with their families. But what they accomplished in the Vietnamese jungle changed special operations forever. The tactics they pioneered, the standards they set, the culture they built, all of it continues to influence elite forces worldwide. When special operations units train today, when they deploy to hostile environments, when they face overwhelming odds with small teams, they're following a model that the Australian SAS perfected in Vietnam. That's the legacy. Not measured in body counts or territory held, but in the enduring influence on how we think about special operations, about what's possible when you have the right people, the right training, and the right culture. The Viet Cong hated fighting the Australian SAS because these men took everything the enemy relied on and turned it against them. The jungle became the SAS's domain. The darkness became their ally. The enemy's own tactics were used more effectively against them. But more than that, the VC hated fighting them because there was no counter. No adaptation that worked. No tactic that could neutralize the threat. The only option was avoidance. And even that didn't always work. That's dominance. That's what happens when skill, discipline, and mateship combine in the most demanding environment imaginable. So when you hear about the Australian SAS in Vietnam, remember this: they weren't mythical warriors. They were real men who faced real danger and overcame it through professionalism, courage, and an absolute commitment to each other. They proved that size doesn't matter when you have skill, that technology doesn't matter when you have discipline, that firepower doesn't matter when you have intelligence and patience. Most importantly, they proved that mateship, that uniquely Australian bond between soldiers, is the foundation of everything. It's what kept them going when everything else said to quit. It's what brought them home when the odds said they shouldn't make it. It's what defines their legacy. The veterans of those patrols are mostly gone now. Time has done what the Vietnamese jungle couldn't. But their legacy lives on in every special operations unit that values skill over strength, patience over aggression, and team over individual. It lives on in the Australian Special Forces, who carry the same badge, follow the same traditions, and uphold the same standards. And it lives on in the memories of those who served, who remember the heat and the rain and the fear, but who also remember the pride of serving with the best, of being part of something greater than themselves. One final reflection from a veteran in his 80s, speaking at a memorial service. We were young, we were scared, but we had each other, and that made us unstoppable. I'd do it all again tomorrow if these blokes were beside me. That's the story of why the Viet Cong hated fighting the Australian SAS. Not because they were cruel or ruthless, but because they were simply better. Better trained, better disciplined, better led, and better bonded. They were silent hunters. They were ghosts. They were Ma. But most importantly, they were mates. And that made all the difference.